Welcome to the Pellegrino Taylor Show. Well, obviously, the Ukraine war and its consequences are enormous for Europe. We're seeing the British are now talking about preparing for a war footing. Is that reality, or is it just more talk? We've seen the aftermath of that devastating attack on the Russian strategic bomber fleet at the weekend. Well, some people saying, well, I mean, most the Russians have got nuclear missiles and submarines, and it doesn't really matter that much. A lot of pro-Russians on Twitter exploding with rage and saying that World War III is nigh. Meanwhile, there is the Istanbul talks took place yesterday or earlier this week, and we'll be discussing those because is it a glimmer of hope? I mean, Georgia is better than War. And they have actually started talking to each other. It turns out that the Russians have thousands of deep frozen Ukrainian bodies, which they're now returning. And presumably the Ukrainians could do that if they've done the same to Russians. So there is a glimmer of hope there, but it's an ever-evolving situation of great complexity, which is why I'm very glad to welcome our today's guest, who's Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, who is a leading British historian, analyst, and author specializing in Russia and the former USSR. He earned his bachelor's in law and modern history at London Guildhall University, got a master's degree in modern history at Royal Holloway, University of London, and was also awarded a PhD in Russian history at that institution. Welcome to the show, Marcus.
Thank you ever so much for having me. I'm always grateful for the opportunity to express my opinions. So again, I'm grateful.
Not at all. Well, let's start off with that, the weekend's attack, because it's the first thing chronologically, and then we'll go on about the Istanbul talks. There were a lot of people worried that it was the beginning of World War III, and then it turned out that some of these bombings were taken clipped from a video game called Arma 3. So there's a scene in that video game where Russia's strategic bombers are parked on the tarmac and they're all blown up, and that's not true. So it could be that there weren't that many strategic bombers blown up to only about 4 or 5, whereas the Ukrainians, cited as always uncritically by the British press, said about 40, which is about 2/3 of them had been blown up. What's your estimate of what actually happened, and what are the consequences of it?
Well, first of all, allow me to say this. The Ukrainian attack on Russian strategic air bases has had and will not have any impact on the battlefield in Ukraine. Indeed, as we speak now, the Russian army is advancing in the oblasts of Sumy, Donetsk, and Zaporozhie. Furthermore, the Russian army is now at the border with another oblast, namely Dnipropetrovsk. And I have no doubt whatsoever that the Russian army will sooner rather than later enter the oblast of Dnipropetrovsk. Also, it should be known that there is a reason as to why Russian strategic nuclear bombers are parked openly on runways. America and Russia have between themselves a number of agreements relating to their strategic nuclear forces, one being that American nuclear bombers and Russian nuclear bombers have to be parked out in the open so that both sides, using their satellites, can monitor each other. So that is the reason as to why Russian strategic nuclear bombers are parked in the open. In addition to that, let me say this regarding the idiots in America and in Britain who were celebrating the destruction of 4 or 5 Russian strategic nuclear bombers. By these idiots celebrating that act by the Ukrainians, they are helping to undermine nuclear agreements between Washington and Moscow, which are absolutely imperative for the preservation of planet Earth and the preservation of human life. But going back to your original question, the Ukrainian act was undoubtedly conceived by people outside of Ukraine, namely in Western countries. 40 or 41 Russian strategic nuclear bombers were not destroyed by the Ukrainians. Indeed, the figure now is, as I just mentioned, between 4 and 5. But there is something that so many ordinary people in the Western world are utterly ignorant about, and it goes to show just how remarkably stupid the average Westerner is. Russia is not just a nuclear superpower, Russia is a military superpower. Russia, if need be, can call up 23 million soldiers. All in all, Russia has, in terms of tanks on active duty, in service, and in storage, over 26,000. The Russian armament sector, which was developed under Stalin during the 5-year plans, can replenish any Russian losses on the front line within a very short period of time. I urge people to investigate the Russian city of Magnitotorsk, which is close to the border with Kazakhstan. There you will find there are Russian armaments factories which are the size of small towns in Britain and in other countries. So again, even if Russia lost, let's say, 4 or 5 strategic nuclear bombers, they have more in storage. And furthermore, they can replace those losses. Ever since the start of the Cold War in 1947, the Russian military has been prepared to fight a conventional war with America. And likewise, the Americans can incur X amount of losses, for example, in Afghanistan or in Iraq. Within a very short period of time, the American military industrial complex can replenish those losses. That is why America and Russia are the two superpowers in the world.
Do you want to be more? You said, I mean, that leads us perhaps into the topic of what happened really behind the scenes, because a lot of people think that Trump is just a blowhard and a secret neocon. So that logic fits there. A lot of people like myself kind of place some hopes in Trump that he really wants to end this war. So the question is, if there was Western assistance, what kind of Western assistance was it? And how far high? I mean, was Trump ignorant of it, which is bad enough in itself? Did he give his approval because we know the neocons in his administration? Maybe he himself wanted to put pressure on the Russians. There was that Twitter, Truth Social post he put out a few days ago saying, "I've protected Putin from a lot of bad things." And maybe he wanted to put pressure on Putin by withdrawing his protection of Putin and just showing what the Americans could do. Or was it perhaps the Europeans, and mainly the British, who wanted to sabotage this by helping the Ukrainians, and because they hate a rapprochement between the Americans and the Russians?
All in all, since Trump entered the White House, I am happy with his policies. Of course, as with any other politician, you will never agree wholeheartedly with everything that a politician says and does. But for the first time in my lifetime, in 46 years, we have someone in the White House who is not a warmonger. That counts for something. Over the last 30 years or so, millions of innocent civilians, including women and children, have died agonizing deaths as a result of wars of conquest launched by America, Britain, and numerous other NATO members. So I am hopeful with Trump. I am not a fantasist. I'm not an optimist. I'm not a pessimist, but I am brutally realistic. For the first time, we have someone in the White House who is a warmonger and someone who is ferociously anti-woke. That counts for something. As I have been saying since the beginning of the year in relation to Trump, take the good things that come from his presidency, deal with the bad things. But something is better than nothing. In Britain, we get nothing, absolutely nothing. Now, in regard to Trump and Ukraine, Trump is not fully in control of America. After all, the deep state is still entrenched in power. The deep state controls the military, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the State Department, and numerous other American government institutions. Can Trump purge them. It's possible. Of course, it's not a one-man show. The Trump administration will have to purge America of the deep state, but this will take many years. That is why it is imperative for Trump to build a foundation upon which his successors can continue the work of removing the deep state from America. But at present, it is the deep state in America, the deep state in Britain, and the deep state in Europe, which is continuing the war in Ukraine, which is continuing support to Zelensky and his henchmen. And it is the aforementioned deep states which, in my opinion, conceived the idea that the Ukrainians should attack Russian strategic nuclear bases. Was Trump aware? I have no way of knowing. Would he have been in support of that? No, because he genuinely believes that war is immoral. And I think more so because he's a businessman, he sees it as a complete waste of money. Furthermore, he does not regard Russia as an enemy. Russia is a European country, or partly European country. Russia is a Christian country. Russia poses no threat to the Western world. And as Trump has said before, the real enemy, which is devouring the Western world, which is devouring Western civilization, partly through bringing immigrants from outside of the Western world into the Western world to destroy the Western world. The enemy who is behind that, as Trump has said, is in the Western world. So Trump, no doubt, would have been against the attacks on the Russian strategic nuclear bases. But as I said, one way or another, the deep state in America has to be removed, and the deep state will not go quietly. They will put up ferocious resistance. But again, Trump is not fully in charge of America.
Well, I mean, I had a discussion yesterday with a guest who said that, who's not a Trump fan. I am. There's nothing I could disagree with in what you said. But he said that, I said, well, he's got rid of USAID and he's closing down the National Security Council. Yeah, but he's just repositioning himself for the American Empire 2.0 with sort of AI intelligence operations and so on. So he thought it was just a brief retrenchment. But I tend to believe with you, but we'll see. And I'm still optimistic, but maybe that's because I'm an optimist by nature. We're just going to go into a break. Back after the break.
Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk, The Pulse.
Welcome back to the Papadopoulos Taylor Show. We've got Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos with us, who's a Russia expert, a PhD, and he's located in the UK at the moment, and I'm not. Official Britain, which is my main contact with Britain at the moment, or Media Britain, doesn't say anything. Other things that you're saying, which is why we're happy to have you on the show, because we represent the alternative point of view. Among normal people, you're a witness, as it were. You living in the UK, meet people who do they believe their media narratives? Do they believe the Daily Telegraph that Putin is losing, that Putin uses washing machines and scavenges them for microchips, that the Iskanders are no good, and the Russians are dying from sanctions? Do they believe that, or is there a widespread skepticism?
Well, let us not forget that according to British mainstream media, old age pensioners in Ukraine have been shooting down Russian fighter aircraft with hunting rifles. Furthermore, also according to British mainstream media, Ukrainian housewives standing on the balconies of their flats have been bringing down Russian drones by throwing jars of tomatoes at them. Well, let me say this, first of all. Britain is not a democracy. Britain is a tyranny and a kleptocracy. Tyranny comes in many shapes and forms. North Korea is overtly a tyranny. And quite frankly, I have more respect for a tyranny like North Korea than I do for a tyranny like Britain. Why? Because at least the North Korean government is open about being a tyranny. The North Koreans say, yes, we are a one-party state. And these are the reasons why we are a one-party state. Now, I disagree with any tyranny, But the point is, I have more respect for them because they are open about being a one-party state. Britain is the cleverest and most devious of all tyrannies in the world. And quite frankly, it has been for centuries. That all said, ever since the pandemic, the British people in vast numbers have woken up. It is quite an extraordinary development. Prior to the pandemic of 2020, I would be talking in a futile way with ordinary Britons about the need to pay attention to what is happening in towns and cities and villages and hamlets across the UK. I was urging ordinary Britons to pay attention to what the British ruling elite is doing abroad, such as in Eastern Europe and in Syria. But it was an exercise in futility. The average British person prior to 2020 simply was not interested. They were obsessed with celebrity culture, with reality television, and God knows what else on their decadent, deviant television sets. But in the last 5 years, 5.5 years now, that has completely changed. Most British people are now alive to the fact that Britain is not a democracy, that the people who rule, not govern, who rule Britain hate the British people. They hate the cultural and spiritual values of the British people. And when I say the British people, I mean the British people. The British people are comprised of 4 nations: the English, the Scottish, the Welsh, and the Northern Irish. Furthermore, the average Briton now understands that British mainstream media is neither free nor independent, but is controlled by the British ruling elite. Thus, most British people do not watch, listen, or read British mainstream media. They are now thinking for themselves. They are now thinking independently and critically. They now understand that the Ukrainian government is one of the most corrupt in the world. And quite frankly, ever since Ukraine became independent in December of 1991, which was against the wishes of the population of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Ukraine has been one of the most corrupt of countries in the world. The average British person now understands that. And the average British person also knows that Russia is not losing in Ukraine, that Russia is not going to be expelled from Ukraine, that Russia will win in Ukraine. So again, the pandemic, in spite of all the horrors that came with it, the horrific levels of repression, the destruction of civil liberties, for example, the right to free speech, the right to protest. In spite of all of that, the pandemic has proved to be a catalyst. It has brought about an awakening in Britain. So it just goes to show things happen for a reason.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you had, I read the Telegraph's comments, to their warmongering journalists. I hate journalists. I mean, if a hate crime is something that you're prosecuted for because you're saying to someone, hate this guy and kill him because he's the wrong skin color. But I mean, aren't British journalists engaging in hate crimes against Russians every day, and with far bigger consequences than the guy next to you getting knocked over, because it's nuclear war and destruction of and the British were at it before World War One, so it's not a new thing. I was just writing about that. Anyway, these warmongering articles every day in The Guardian and The Telegraph, so both left and right, nominally speaking, there's a lot of comments pushed back, and these are kind of conservative readers, and they're saying more or less things that you're saying. And I don't think you'd see that a couple of years ago. And the other thing I was going to say is that obviously the Reform Party, they've grown. I mean, was it the local elections? They're now set to wipe out all the other parties, and because of the UK election system, they're going to win all the seats, now working in their favour, this first past the post. But I noticed that after those local elections, that very next day, Starmer launched some attack on Russia. So, and the mainstream media went with him. So the BBC and the Guardian downgraded the importance of the sort of domestic revolution to focus on Russia again. And this is what worries me. That to forestall a popular revolution, I mean, the anger that you're feeling, I think a lot of Brits feel real anger, and they will launch a war, and that will quieten down. You know, that they'll quell the domestic revolution, because once you have a war, you're in a totally different ball game. Is that something you worry about?
Starmer, first of all, is a puppet, as are the rest of the cabinet. Indeed, the opposition in Britain are puppets. The heart of the British establishment, or the heart of the British ruling elite, is the monarchy, followed by the aristocracy, followed by the banking elites, the media barons, the top brass of the military, the top brass of the intelligence community. So again, Starmer is merely a puppet. As regards to provoking a war, there will not be a third world war. Why? Because the Americans and the Russians, ever since the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, have established and maintained channels of communications between themselves, which ensure that what I call the elite of the elite in Russia and in America, people whose names you do not know, people who you will never see on television, they speak with each other every single day of the year. It is their job to ensure that there will not be a war between themselves, because a war between America and Russia would result in the destruction of Earth. So when the puppet Starmer talks about a possible war in Europe, which would be launched by Russia, he is saying, or the British establishment is saying, that through the puppet Starmer as a way of trying to deflect the British public's attention away from the real problems in the UK, from the real menace to the UK. That is why the British establishment is saying that. After all, the Americans on numerous occasions before in the past have had to discipline the British establishment. For example, during the Suez Canal crisis, the British and the French tried to drag America, at the time under Eisenhower, into a war with the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower disciplined the British. At that time, the Prime Minister was Eden. The British learnt a lesson. Also, during the criminal and murderous NATO war against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999, the British were trying to provoke a war whereby there would be a NATO invasion, ground invasion of Yugoslavia, and they were trying to provoke a war between America and Russia. And the Americans put the British establishment in its place. And the Prime Minister of Britain at that time was, of course, the putrid Tony Blair. So the British and the French ruling elite and the German ruling elite, they can say whatever they want in public. In reality, they cannot provoke a war. After all, who provides the military security to Britain, France, and Germany? The Americans. And the Americans in private, they tell the Europeans what to do. So there won't be a war. But still, by carrying out certain acts in Eastern Europe, which undoubtedly European elites are, that could bring about an accidental war with Russia. And of course, a war is a war is a war. But aside from that happening, there will not be a nuclear war.
Yeah, well, that's hopeful. And I think you're right. I think I always said from the beginning of this crisis, I thought the British fingerprints all over it. There's a guy called Kit Clarenberg. You probably know him. He writes substacks to that effect. But that that this could end up in a gigantic post-Suez hangover for the British establishment, you know, because Britain lost its empire famously, and they felt handed over the baton also, and everyone knows that Suez was a humiliation. And I think this can end up as a very public humiliation for the Brits. I'm afraid we've got to wind up there, Marcus. An incredibly interesting discussion. I'd love to have you on again to discuss. I remember the Yugoslav War of 1999, and but I didn't remember. Even then, I was skeptical in the media. But I'd love to explore with you that the idea that the British wanted to provoke a third world war there, and it doesn't surprise me at all. And I know that Tony Blair, he'd sprinkled too much adrenaline into his cornflakes, I remember Clinton saying just before the Kosovo. And that's coming from Clinton, who's no slouch himself when it comes to intervention. Thank you so much, sir. This is the Pale and Taylor Show, and I'll be back after the break.